What if most of the chronic diseases we're seeing today, including chronic pain, are connected to something we can't even see? That's what we're talking about today on Wellness by Design. I'm your host, Jane Hogan, the wellness engineer, and my guest today is Martha Carlin. When Martha's husband was diagnosed with Parkinson's disease, she began a search for answers. That search led her to the microbiome and how these organisms can be playing a bigger role in our health than people could have ever imagined. I hope you enjoy this episode. Stay tuned till the end because Martha shares something that, after all her research, she says you need to pay attention to today. So if you are new here, welcome. I'm so happy you're here and that you found us. If you are a longtime listener, thank you. Thank you so much for helping this podcast reach top 3% in alternative health in the world. It's because of you that this has happened. So I'm just so grateful to you. And if you haven't yet got your free copy of my book, Pain Free on Purpose, then you can do that. Just go to thewellnessengineer.com/free chapter to get your free chapter of Pain Free on Purpose. Okay, I'll see you inside the episode. And if you haven't subscribed yet, please do so. Leave a comment. I read every one of them, and I really love hearing what you think of the topics that we're talking about and what your insights are. Okay, I'll see you inside. Martha Carlin, welcome to Wellness by Design today. I've been really looking forward to this conversation with you. You're so much fun, and we've got some great things to share with people. It could be life-changing. So welcome.
Thanks so much for having me, Jane.
We were having a little chuckle before we hit record because I was saying that the first time I met you, you were wearing a poop on your head. It was an emoji poop cap. So why did you have that on? And also, well, the bigger thing behind it is like, what took you to that work that you're doing now?
Yes, so we were both at the Mindshare meeting last year, and one of the things they had was a superhero event. So most people were coming as your classic superhero looking type. And because I founded a company called the BioCollective that collects people's poop to try to figure out what's missing and connect the dots to chronic disease and health, I decided to be the super pooper. And so we found a poop emoji, a t-shirt with the GI tract on it, and I had a cape that said super pooper. And so, that actually,
why wouldn't you?
Got a little bit of attention. But how I ended up getting there, my husband, when I was 40 and my husband was 44, he was diagnosed with young onset Parkinson's. And I just really couldn't understand how a young, healthy looking, he had just run the San Diego Marathon, young man had an old person's disease. And so I started this process of really trying to understand what could have been the causal factors of that. And in the process, 12 years into it, after spending a lot of time looking at food and nutrition and water quality and some of the things environmentally that were impacting John's health and other people with Parkinson's, read a book called Missing Microbes by Dr. Martin Blaser. Mm-hmm. And he was talking about growing up in the age of antibiotics and how that had impacted something called the microbiome, which I had never heard of. And of course, now people, I think, it's more commonly known. The microbiome is the trillions of bacteria, fungi, viruses, and protists that live in and on our body, and they function as an internal pharmacy to maintain our health. They're making vitamins, hormones, and neurotransmitters. And, all of the environmental things that we're coming in contact with are depleting the diversity of that microbiome and affecting the ability for us to make these important compounds. And, in fact, we are more microbial than we are human. Mm-hmm. In terms of cell count, it's about 2 microbial cells to every 1 human cell. And in terms of genes and functions, it's anywhere from 100 to 300 times more function that's coming into our body from the microbes than from our own genome. So, it was really underappreciated how much this microbial partnership is impacting our health. And there's been a tremendous amount of progress. I founded the company in 2015, and we collected people's stool samples for 7 years. And then from that process, went on to develop a line of probiotics to put back functions that we could see people have lost. And also founded another company called Ancient Organics Bioscience that makes microbial teams for soil to do the same thing, to restore the vitality of the soil and, our microbiome in the soil. So we're interconnected through the soil, the microbes in the soil that make our food healthy, that help plants take up nutrition and make them nutritious. And then we eat those. And that's the interconnected relationship between the soil and the food and the human microbiome. And then all the way back to the waste goes out. And with a cow, that's part of what's fertilizing the soil and putting microbes back in.
Big cycle.
It's a big cycle.
I think you and I discovered the microbiome around the same time, and it was brand new to me. I mean, I was like you. I wasn't in the health world. You weren't in the health world. For me, it was my own health. For you, it was your husband's health that drew you there. And for the people that are watching and listening, the microbiome and gut health impacts every aspect of your health. And when that's out of balance, it can lead to chronic conditions, but it can also cause pain. So the people that are in the audience, know that if you're experiencing pain, the microbiome could be part of it. So let's hear a little bit about your journey with the microbiome, what you learned, obviously we know why you were driven by love and curiosity, right? To try to solve this problem with your husband, because when someone gets a diagnosis of Parkinson's disease, it's not usually like, oh, we can fix this. Right.
Well, so my original background and training was I had a degree in accounting from college, a system that has to balance. And I was trained as an auditor, which trains you to be a skeptic, never take anything at face value, examine the evidence for yourself. So lots of critical thinking. And so, we're told it's a progressive neurological disease. There's no cure. We have some symptom treatment that works for about 4 or 5 years. So you're hearing, okay, I've got 4 or 5 good years left, really. And I just that just didn't make any sense to me. It was like, okay, there has to be more going on here. And so I started looking for causal factors. And I really did start first with the food, but that was in part because a week after John was diagnosed, I happened to have already booked this yoga retreat in Costa Rica. And I went to, sorry, I'm telling him not to come out to this patio. To this yoga retreat, and one of the speakers there was talking about Weston Price. I don't know if you're familiar with him, but he was a dentist in the United States who really discovered what the Western diet was doing to our health, and this loss of traditional foods, fermented foods, nutrient-dense foods, and traveled the world looking at that. And so I've had the benefit of actually learning about this a week after John's diagnosis. So I came back and threw everything in the pantry out, all of the prepackaged foods, everything that was processed, all the things in the freezer. We had the Schwann's truck coming every week and getting the frozen foods. And I was traveling about 50% of the time. So, it was convenient for John to be able to feed himself and the kids that way. But we learned that really wasn't good. There's lots of these preservatives and different things. And also, John had been drinking a soy protein shake every day, every morning, for about 2 years prior to his Parkinson's diagnosis. So I came back and I found a book called The Whole Soy Story. And it was quite a thick book, just reading about the history of soy and really starting to understand that was one of the main food ingredients but also, had been broken down into lots of different parts and sold, like soy protein or soy milk. He was drinking a lot of soy milk. And that at that time, 97% of the soy was genetically modified, and they were spraying something called glyphosate on it. And I didn't even know what it was. And so I started looking at glyphosate, and I've spent 20 years looking at glyphosate and understanding how it works within the whole system. So, most people think about it, it's like killing a weed, but it does that by many mechanisms. So one is dehydration. One is it binds the minerals that are critical for this pathway that in the plant makes aromatic amino acids that are very important. We don't make those ourselves. We get them through our diet or through the microbes in our gut. And so, like, connecting the dots to all those pieces through the food was kind of that real first action that I took. And it had such a profound difference because, within a month of doing that, he no longer had a visible tremor. And he never really had a very visible tremor after that. So, we started there, then we moved on to looking at water and, thinking our water is clean in America, and it really is not, because, it was designed, our water treatment systems were designed for killing bacteria, but not for dealing with all the chemicals that come into the water supply now, and all the drugs that your neighbor is taking and peeing down, or even, John's dopamine medication that he's peeing out, and, is in the water supply. And the environmental working group had, I think it's pretty old too. It was back in 2012, I think. They did 20 major cities in the U.S. and what are the pharmaceuticals and chemicals that are primarily in your water. And you can get that information, some of that information, from your local water company, but not all of that. And so we started filtering our water, and just some of those basic environmental things. Initially, I saw what a difference they made. And then when I read about the microbiome in 2014, I was like, oh, well, that's how all this is connected, because it has a profound impact on this microbiome that is, making our vitamins, transforming our food, making minerals bioavailable, like all of the stuff that we need to live a long and healthy life. The microbiome is our most important partner for that.
Yeah, I mean, people don't often think, oh, well, all this stuff that preserves food or these things that kill bacteria, if we are ingesting them, it's not going to be helpful for our bacteria. I mean, I've heard I don't know if this has really been accepted. You would probably know, Martha, but I've heard people say that the microbiome is so important, should be considered an organ. Have you heard that?
Yes, absolutely. And, I would say probably maybe the most important. I don't know if it's the most important organ, because you do need your heart to pump.
Well,
But
everything needs to work.
it all needs to work together, but it's a huge organ that, was completely underappreciated. And
and not even known about. I remember I'd started to learn about it, and my doctor knew, but I remember talking to a friend of mine who had an autoimmune condition, telling her about this when I learned it, because I was like, I just wanted to tell everyone, people need to know. And she said she mentioned it to her doctor, and he said, what's the microbiome? Now, I'm sure he knows now, but back then, I mean, they just didn't really learn about it. So,
well, they still don't really learn about it in medical school. And that's one of the things I learned early on. So with the BioCollective, we were sequencing people's samples, and we would send them a 60-page report. So they get this long report. It's all the microbes, bacteria, fungi, viruses, protists, antibiotic resistance genes, bacteriophage, like all these different things. And they would take it to their doctor, and their doctor's like, what is this? Like, what do I do with this? Yeah. And, back in 2015, when people would ask me, like, when do you think this will be in the clinic? And I would say, oh, maybe 10 years. Okay, we're 11 years out. It's not in the clinic. I don't see it getting in the clinic for at least another decade, because you've got to go all the way back into medical school and teach people ecosystem dynamics. And I still think, frankly, we don't fully understand the ecosystem dynamics of the gut in order to teach it in a way that, our I hate to say our simplistic way of teaching, but a lot of our processes are about memorizing, memorizing
Yeah.
pharmaceuticals for a symptom, or memorizing parts of a body, or memorizing parts rather than understanding how the whole system works together.
Hmm.
And I still think we're in our infancy of understanding how that whole system works together.
I think you're right. And I think your background, as a critical thinker and noticing anomalies and things like that, questioning things, was an advantage for you. And I feel like that for me too, as an engineer, it was an advantage for me because I'm like looking at the big picture and I'm not caught up with, you know, details about,
Right.
specializing in something. I was like, well, what's the big picture here?
Right. How
And
does it work? Like, how does
yeah,
it all work?
yeah, yeah. And you're not going to wait for it to come through, for them to figure it out. You're looking at your husband and you want to figure this out. And so, what were some of, well, you mentioned about the tremors stopping when you started switching food around. What other successes did you see early on, Martha?
Well, so I founded the BioCollective in 2015. In 2016, so that was 14 years into John's diagnosis. So at that point, he was starting to need a cane to walk. He had some instability issues and having difficulty navigating through crowds, with something called freezing. And we went to a World Parkinson's Congress, and there were some researchers from Israel there, um, showing a publication that showed the sugar alcohol mannitol, it's used as a alternative sweetener in diabetes, and it's also used in a lot of medical situations. It's used to relieve pressure in head trauma, and it's a really interesting molecule. But I came back and bought a little chemistry book on mannitol chemistry, and I was like,
Like
wow,
Martha would.
yeah, this is an amazing molecule. I mean, maybe I should have been an engineer. But and but the first chapter of it was about bacteria that ferment mannitol from glucose and fructose. And of course, I also knew many people with Parkinson's, including my husband, were kind of sugar addicts. And so I thought, like, could we put back a factory in the gut of these bacteria? Like, put a team together that could restore this function in the gut of converting these sugars into mannitol, which is more of a prebiotic for a better gut profile.
Mhm.
And so I had a friend who was a fermentation chemist and had spent 20 years in the probiotics industry. And I said, Steve, what do you think we could put a team together? And he said, I think we can. And through his relationships in the industry, we were able to prototype that product and make 100 bottles of it for free, which was pretty crazy now that I look back at it. And by Christmas time of 2016, we were giving John the probiotic, and we had all this data from sequencing his microbiome previously. So we just started taking samples while he was taking it. And within a month, he was no longer walking with a cane. 4 months later, our daughter's college graduation's like 5,000 people. He was able to navigate the crowd, no problem. And we could see over 120 days of measuring that his microbiome was continuing to improve and get closer and closer and closer to the healthy human microbiome. And there's a UPDR, which is a Uniform Parkinson's Disease Rating, which is how advanced your Parkinson's is. At the time, before he started taking the probiotic, it was a 35, and it improved down to a 20, which is about a 40% improvement. And it was stable there for 4 years until he had COVID. So we could definitely see that modifying the microbiome with a team of probiotics had benefits. There is also another probiotic on the market today that markets specifically to Parkinson's. It's called Neurally, and they've actually done clinical trials in Parkinson's. We did our clinical trial in diabetes. But interestingly, there is overlap in Parkinson's and diabetes, and I'll say pain.
Really?
But in in comorbidities, I had a large hospital data set of 10,000 Parkinson's patients, and the number one comorbidity was related to either hypo or hyperglycemia. So, you know, an, problems with insulin sensitivity and sugar metabolism. And both diabetes and Parkinson's and chronic pain all have an inflammatory trigger called lipopolysaccharide that can be involved in that. And lipopolysaccharide is actually the cell wall of gram-negative bacteria. So it's the bacteria you don't want in your gut. But when you have too many of those, and they grow and die off and leave their cell wall debris behind, your immune system has to deal with that. If you have a leaky gut, that can get across into your bloodstream and go anywhere. So it can cause arthritic pain, it can cause neuroinflammation in the brain, and it can damage the pancreas, so the blood sugar problems. And so in our diabetes trial, we actually measured two things. One, serum endotoxin level, so in the blood, and found a dramatic decrease in endotoxin in the blood. But we also measured the microbiome before and after and saw a significant drop in what's called lipid A, which is part of that endotoxin molecule that causes the inflammation. So, very exciting to see that we could modulate the microbiome. One, we're focusing on diet and our water supply and all of that, but you could also modify the microbiome with a targeted probiotic.
I remember Stephen Gundry talking about LPS in his book, and he nicknamed it Little Pieces of.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. Okay, this is really interesting about the changes in blood sugar levels, I guess technically blood glucose levels with this, because I remember hearing somewhere along the way that, is there a dog or something that can be trained? They can smell Parkinson's?
Yes.
Like before someone actually is diagnosed with it.
Well, there's actually a woman.
Oh, it's a person. Okay.
Yeah, it's a person, and I can't remember her name right now, but I wrote about her in the book. And smell, because there are a number of different smells, I'll say, and one of them, John was a marathon runner and an athlete, and in his synthetic clothing, you could not get this smell out. It was a very distinct smell. I can't really describe it to you, but there's another young onset young woman that I write about in the book who 2 years leading up to her Parkinson's diagnosis, every morning when she woke up, her hands smelled like ammonia. Well, that's the breakdown of protein, breaking down in the body. And that also ties to what's going on in the microbiome and some of what we published in a paper in April of this year. So those are some of the smells. But this woman in England, I guess she continued going to the Parkinson support groups after her husband died, and she found there was a Parkinson smell. And so these researchers started testing her and just taking a t-shirt that somebody had worn. And so she went through and she got all of them except for one she got wrong, because she said the person had Parkinson's, and they said, no, they don't. And then 6 months later, they were diagnosed with Parkinson's. So that's how subtle her smell capability was of that. And they've gone on. I don't believe they've disclosed yet what the molecule or molecules are, probably because they're trying to patent something, which is something I talk about in the book too, is my frustration of lack of transparency of some of the research, because people want to patent things, and if you disclose it, you can't patent it. But that was really interesting. But, the flip side of that is people with Parkinson's also lose their sense of smell. So that's one of the early signs that you may be at risk for Parkinson's. It was also something post-COVID that people got, a loss of sense of smell. And there are two hypotheses now with Parkinson's: brain first or body first. And those kind of go with colonization of specific microbes through breathing or chemical assaults coming through the nose. And, that barrier right there close to the brain and the impact of what's going on there. Or things coming in orally, whether that's, consumed chemical assaults and that sort of thing, or specific microbes, or both, and how the two different brain first or body first move at different paces, and how that kind of works in the system.
There's so much to learn in all this. Because I've heard also that, I was diagnosed with rheumatoid arthritis, and there was a connection between mouth bacteria and rheumatoid arthritis, but there's also a connection between, I believe, mouth bacteria and Alzheimer's.
Yes.
So, we have, because of course we have a microbiome in our mouth as well, and on our skin, everywhere we've got a microbiome. The biggest one is in the gut, of course, but these microbes are impacting our lives every day and can, well, of course, manifest in illness if they're out of balance. As you said, the problem is with chemicals, with the food that we're eating. Stress, plays a role as well. What did you learn about the role of stress, Martha? Because I'm always concerned about this, and it's where I've zoned in on.
So I think that really came to light even more as I was writing the book. I knew stress played a role, and I did start working on a Voices of Parkinson's docuseries not long before John passed away. So most of the work was done after John passed away. But starting to put together the picture and looking back at John's and my life of different stress points, like even before he was diagnosed, he was on a rafting trip down the Gunnison River that nearly killed him. And, that was a huge stress, fight or flight thing that, could have triggered something. There's a traditional Chinese medicine woman who has a book called Stuck on Pause that talks about events like that can be a triggering event. But also, I worked out of town 50% of the time. So I was gone on airplanes. We had young kids. John was staying at home with the kids, raising the kids. There's lots going on when you got 3 kids at home, and, you're trying to juggle all of those things. And so that was a big part of the stressor. He was also part of Douglas County Search and Rescue, which is like here in Colorado in the Rampart Range of the mountains. So when I was home, he would get these phone calls at 10, 11 o'clock at night. So-and-so's missing. Like, I got to go out with search and rescue. So, wake him up or postpone his sleep and then be out all night long searching for somebody. And
that's not a peaceful experience.
That is not a peaceful experience. And sometimes they would find people who were, dead. And that's also kind of a shocking. Yeah. So, there are all these little stressors. And then, one of the things I learned over the years, I think I touch on this in the book. I do talk about it a lot of times, is just my own learning about myself and my contribution to creating stress, because I'm a type A person. I was trying to solve the problem. I worked initially, before I founded the company, I worked in a very high powered corporate job, high expectations, real intensity. And I brought that same action home. And that creates a low grade chronic stress for everyone, and a feeling that, oh my God, I could never meet this woman's expectations. And I came to that realization, I'll say a little late in the process, 10, 12 years in, partly also from seeing the same behaviors in other wives of men with Parkinson's. And I'm like, oh my God, we're part of the problem. And so I started working on my own behavior and like turning down the dial of my own behavior. And John was like, we had a number of conversations about it and how much he appreciated me actively working to change my own behavior to help modulate his stress level. So that was a stress level. We moved, we built a house. Building a house is a stressful event. We lived there for 9 years. Then we moved again. We moved several different times. Moving is an incredible stressor that you don't even realize at the time how much stress that creates. So it's all this sort of little buildup, and there's something called allostatic load, which
Yeah.
is now becoming more appreciated, that you can layer and layer and layer on these stressors. You're resilient, and then it's like the straw that breaks a camel's back. It might be something really small, and it doesn't seem like, how could that have been it? But it's like that last piece of the allostatic load that just is like, and it's like you can't take that one straw off the camel and the camel get up. You've got to
Yeah.
like unwind a lot of stuff.
Mm-hmm.
And a lot of it is emotional. So, and
Yeah.
that's something else I talk about in the book. And I think you work with people on this too, is, our emotions and the spiritual aspect of, like not feeling worthy. And, if you go back to my high expectations of people, I like, can I meet her expectations? It also goes back into religion. Can I meet, God's expectations? Am I
My
worthy?
religion's expectations.
And
Yeah.
religious expectations that are set on us. And, John went to 12 years of Catholic school, which is a pretty good indoctrination of thinking that you might not be totally worthy.
Yeah. Oh my goodness, so much going on there. And do you think sometimes I really, I'm like sort of like mind, body, spirit stuff, but also like very physical. Like the physical aspect of that is that it disrupts the microbiome. Is
Well,
that correct?
it disrupts the microbiome, but I think it also disrupts like some of our neurosensory aspects. I have a chapter in the book. It's called The Mouth of God. And I ended up connecting that to a Radio Lab episode that I listened to called Song of the Cerebellum. And that's this part of the back part of the brain, which they used to think wasn't really important. But it's this really important timing engine that's sort of coordinating everything. And that's also, where these signals of stress and things come through. So, yeah. And the microbiome, of course, is signaling with all of that too. So.
Yeah. And it could be sort of the downstream thing of your stress. So then your digestive system isn't working so well. So then it's not producing as much stomach acid. So that, those kinds of, it's like a fallout effect, right?
Right.
Yeah. So it could be that. Okay. You've mentioned the book a couple of times. So we need to tell people about your book. It's called Connected: Love, Loss, and the Unseen Forces Behind Chronic Disease. So we've been talking a lot about Parkinson's, but really what you're talking about in this book is really all chronic disease, but the connection with the microbiome, but also so much more, the love story with you and your husband. And I'm so sorry that he did pass. I know it's such a long journey for you, but putting this book together must have been so, I guess, cathartic for you.
Absolutely. I mean, it really was. John and I had talked many times about writing a book and telling our two different aspects of our story. And we just never got there. So the process of writing the book and trying to pull as much of John's story and his resilience, and the fact, like, I want people to know, we got that diagnosis when we heard drugs work for 5 years or whatever, and we're thinking life is over. And, when you read the book, you will see that we had an incredible and adventurous life that was completely full of love, friendship, excitement. John loved to fish. He continued fishing all the way up to the last year of his life. We did ice climbing in Colorado all the way up through, I think, 2020 until he got COVID. And so, like, I want people to know that your life is not over.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that's a big part of the story. But it's also, in part, there's a lot of spiritual journey in there, my own spiritual journey and John's spiritual journey to, ultimately understanding forgiveness and worthiness, so that when he did pass, I think could be in a better place.
Oh, beautiful. What else can people expect from reading this book?
Well, I think they will, as I tell different pieces of the science through story, the story of
Mm-hmm.
our, but it helps people understand some of the complexity of the science. But I think people will have ahas about their own health journey, even that doesn't have anything to do with Parkinson's. They'll start to say, oh, okay, I remember this from my childhood, or I remember this stressor, or I remember, these words I spoke to myself. I talk about the power of words and,
Yeah.
how we pick up words that other people put on us, or we, create our own words. And some of the biggest problem is the words we say to ourselves, that put ourselves down and, um, really cause us to struggle when, if we used empowering words, we would come into our own power.
Mm-hmm. One of the things I really loved about this, what came through in the book and your journey, was asking better questions, right? You can change your life by asking better questions. How would you briefly describe that to people? If someone's facing a chronic condition.
Well, back to that, don't take everything people tell you at face value.
Mm-hmm.
Examine the evidence yourself. And that involves asking questions. Well, why does it, is everyone progressive? Is like, why is that? Why do some people progress really fast and some people really slow? Like, what do you know the answers? If they don't know the answers, then we have to look for the answers. So just that why question, which is kind of funny because children are always asking why, and we're telling them not to ask why. But
Yeah.
I think that was sort of the magic of what I've been able to pull together in my understanding, is having that childlike wonder and asking the why question.
Mm-hmm.
And not taking what somebody says or what's in a textbook and saying, that's the absolute truth. Go, go look at it deeper. And that's actually one of the things. So I talk about Dr. Barry Ninham, the researcher I've been working with for the last 4
Mm-hmm.
years and just published a Parkinson's paper. One of the things he taught me is like talking about cells, and looking at a cell and saying all the things in the textbooks that they attribute to happening in the cell membrane. He's like, if you just use logic and you look at, all these different things that are supposed to be going on, a cell membrane is way too small for that to be happening in the cell membrane. It's happening somewhere else. And so then you start to ask these questions like, oh, and or, in scientific papers, I look at science papers and they come to a conclusion. But if you go back and look at how they set up the experiment, it's like, oh, well, they set this. Why did they set it up like this? And then you start digging. So you can dig down in, like an engineer who's trying to figure out why a machine broke.
Mm-hmm.
You're going through asking, well, why this? Or how did this happen? Or how did this happen? And when you start to do that, you start to get a much richer picture of actually what's happening. And it gives you, oh, well, I can intervene here, or I can intervene here, or, this is something that I can actually do to have an impact on my health in this trajectory.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, like keep being curious, and for the people that don't want to dive into the scientific research, there are people like you, Martha, that are doing that and sharing it and really making it, no pun intended, digestible for people.
Well, I try to make it digestible. I do have, and I think it's pretty digestible in the book. I tried to write some of the complex science in a way that people could understand it better. But sometimes I have a tendency to get a little off in the science and not be that easy to understand. So I'm working on that.
Well, it is a lovely book. Is there anything else we haven't talked about that you really want to make sure the audience knows about?
I think we've covered a bit of the really important things. There's an appendix in the back of the book called "A Simple Place to Start," that gives you some ideas around, this food, water, things to care for your microbiome, air quality. But I also say, one of the things we don't want to do is get too caught up in perfection and this whole list of things we have to check off, because that just creates another stress. So,
Yep.
The journey of 1,000 miles begins with one step. So just make one choice of how you're going to, change your lifestyle in a way that benefits you better, and just do that first. And so, that's probably a missing piece that we haven't talked about. And I think you have maybe you have the book bonus page. If you don't, we'll send you the book bonus page. But on that, with the book bonus, you get an additional download that is of that simple place to start, is a little more detail that you can print out a PDF. And we're going to have an Ask Me Anything on July 30th. And I think they get a PDF copy of my Search for the Perfect Poop book. They'll get a discount for our probiotics as well.
Yeah, because you also have a probiotic company now to help with all of it.
Yep.
Okay, so what would be, until someone gets all that, what would be one thing someone could do today that's going to start shifting them into a more of a healing state? What would you say that is? A tiny action step today.
Stop eating processed food. That might not be a totally tiny action, but if you look at all the processed foods you're eating, maybe look at the one that has the most ingredients on it and get rid of that one.
Especially if you don't recognize the names.
If you don't recognize the names of the food, of anything in the food, get rid of that one, and get rid of like a lot of your prepackaged sauces and salad dressings and things like that. They are actually very damaging to the microbiome and to your cellular membranes.
Okay, great advice. Martha, thank you so much for this today. And you know what I really think you've done with this is sharing empowerment and hope, which I think really is what this podcast is about, sharing empowerment and hope. So thank you for putting that together in this incredible book, Connected: Love, Loss, and the Unseen Forces Behind Chronic Disease. It's a beautiful book. So thank you so much for doing that. And so people can find it, I guess, everywhere. And how would they get the book bonus? Would they go to your website?
So there is a specific link on the website. I will make sure that you got the book bonus page. And so then they just go in there and register. It will send them the book bonus. So you can find it on Barnes & Noble online, Amazon online. You could order it through a local bookstore. It's it's anywhere books are available. Great place to find that. You can also I write a blog on our BiotiQuest website, and that's BiotiQuest.com.
Okay, perfect. And what date does the book come out? It's brand new, right?
Yep, came out last Wednesday, actually. So the 24th was our opening day, and we hit number 1 in 3 categories on Kindle, and number 1 briefly in Parkinson's in print, and I think then it went to number 2, and it's a week later we're on number 5, but we're still pretty nice in the top there. So kind of exciting.
Well, congratulations on that. Now this podcast, when this comes out, the book is definitely available. So it's just go ahead and look it up. Okay. Thank you so much for being a guest on the podcast today, Martha, and this incredible body of work that you've put together, shifting your whole career focus, becoming a scientist, and really changing people's lives, including your husband's life. And well, then that affects you, your family, and everyone. And now you're helping other people as well. So thank you so much for that, Martha.
Thanks so much for having me today. I enjoyed it, Jane.
And to all the people watching and listening. So do you know someone with a chronic condition? Probably, because so many people have them. Share this with them so that they can also feel hope and empowerment. All right, I'll see you again soon on Wellness by Design.